Well, the Assembly in Massachusetts then was probably more parsimonious than the Assembly today, and was worried about judges in Massachusetts not being answerable to the people who chose them, having an influence from beyond Massachusetts on the judicial proceedings. So the Massachusetts Assembly demanded that all the judges in Massachusetts refuse this stipend, under penalty of actually having the Assembly remove them from the bench entirely or raising public opprobrium in other ways. And every judge in Massachusetts agreed not to accept the Crown's salary, rejecting it out of hand. Every judge but one. And that was the Chief Justice of the Superior Court, Peter Oliver. And Judge Oliver was an ironmonger, that is, he had an iron business. And being a judge actually cost him a good deal of time as well as money from his business, as judges then had to travel throughout the province hearing cases. And is anyone here a judge, by the way? So I'm told that the cases usually aren't that interesting. You go out to Worcester and you have to stay in a tavern, might sound more appealing to some of you than others, and often sleeping in the same rooms with all of the counsel who would travel around the province together. The cases would be heard in the tavern room, and you would travel from place to place hearing these cases of farmers and mechanics, which usually weren't very interesting. And Oliver reckoned how much he spent every year on doing this, and the £200 a year the Crown was offering didn't even come close to meeting his expenses. So he had no problem with accepting this. If the Crown wanted to give him £200 a year, well, that was more to the good. The Assembly wasn't happy with this because, according to the Charter of 1691, it was the Assembly's prerogative to pay the judges. Judges could not accept a salary from someone else. Clearly, it said in the Charter that the Assembly paid the judges. And here, Judge Oliver said, and incidentally, Judge Oliver was also the brother-in-law of Governor Hutchinson. And his brother Andrew, presided over the governor's council, was the secretary of the province. And in fact, is anyone here an Oliver or a Hutchinson? Okay. Good people. Dedicated public servants, I should say, because in the 1760s, Thomas Hutchinson had been both the Chief Justice and the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts. And then when he was elevated to being Governor of Massachusetts, he obviously had to give up being Lieutenant Governor, and that position fell to Andrew Oliver, and the position of Chief Justice went to Peter Oliver. And beginning in the 1770s, the Oliver and the Hutchinson children began to marry, and they always seemed to marry others. Hutchinson's married Olivers and no one else, probably for good reason. And if you're not a Hutchinson or an Oliver, say if you're an Otis or an Adams, you may look at this and see a concentration of power in the hands of one small elite group. Is that true? Have I misrepresented the case? Okay. But then the question becomes, what can we do if a judge does something which we say he ought not to do, accept the Crown's salary, which we say violates the Charter? Well, John Adams, a member of the Assembly, said, we can impeach him. And the other members of the Assembly listening to him say, well, that doesn't really make much sense. No Assembly has ever impeached a Crown official before. That's reason number one not to do it. Reason number two, the Assembly will impeach Judge Oliver. Then the case presumably would go to the Governor's Council, and presiding over the Governor's Council is, of course, Governor Hutchinson, his brother-in-law, and also on the Governor's Council is his brother Andrew, and what Governor Hutchinson will say is the Assembly can't impeach Crown officials and will simply toss it out. And John Adams said, really doesn't matter. We can impeach him, and we have to. So the Assembly did impeach Judge Oliver in 1772, and then predictably enough, it got to the Governor's Council, and Governor Hutchinson said the Assembly can't impeach Crown officials, and he didn't want to hear anything more about it. So it was a troubling thing for Governor Hutchinson, though, that these Adamses were raising these problems with committees of correspondence and so on, and the impeachment of Judge Oliver, but he had weathered these two storms in 1772, and so thought that January of 1773 would be a propitious time to raise another problem which he saw festering here.